But then he says something very important. Look to verse 3. He says, "And in their greed they will exploit you with false words." And then he says, "Their condemnation from long ago is not idle, and their destruction is not asleep." Peter's not playing around here. He teaches all of us a lesson in 2020 America that we need to learn, in which we foolishly presume in the name of charity that false teachers mean well most of the time. They're only misguided. In the name of charity, blasphemers are too often presumed to be brethren. Liars are considered just in need of learning. And anti-Bible revelers are considered just a tad ignorant, perhaps in need of some instruction, but not anathematization. But Peter says, listen to what he says, quote, "Their condemnation from long ago is not idle." In other words, they are marked for God's righteous condemnation and predestined for God's wrath. I'll give you an example just from this week. For more than a decade, I have warned about Beth Moore. I've screamed until my face is blue. I've written nearly 300 articles outlining her explicitly false teachings, a leftward trajectory, serving as a Pied Piper to as who the Scripture refers to as leading captive weak women. And although fairly alone in the beginning, the cries for discernment regarding the devil's saboteur have reached fever pitch and a crescendo as now tens or hundreds of thousands of Christians are saying, okay, but what she's saying here is not biblical. It makes us feel good, but it doesn't accord to Scripture. And I've been saying loudly, this woman's not one of us, acts like us, looks like us, talks like us, uses our language. But when you look closely, she's not one of us. She's a siren calling out to naive housewives with ineffectual husbands and weak pastors and leading them astray. And this week she left the Southern Baptist Convention because they are too conservative for her as she's been on this leftward trajectory. There are some believers in the convention who will not trope with light loafers and a skip towards the abominable doctrines of social religion, Marxism disguised as Christianity. And I thought it ironic that when she left, she said these words. She says, this is, quote, "just not who I am." And I thought, that's what I've been saying for 10 years. This is not who you are. Do you think that she didn't know that? Did she just come to a revelation? She just now figured this out? You see, the goal of a false teacher who is a willing participant in the schemes of the devil is to remain covert and undercover, disguised as a Christian, for as long as humanly possible until discerning believers smoke them out like foxes out of their dens, and they have no choice then to just come out and say, "You're right, this is not who I am." And you know that there's deceit when the rest of us see it before they admit it, right? You get that logically. We've been saying it for decades. There's no shortage of teachers like her in our day. And the job of the Christian church is to, quote, according to Romans 16, verse 17 and 18, "Mark those who cause division by teaching that which is contrary to sound doctrine, and to avoid them." And so I recognize fully, I just breached the decorum of the 21st century church by naming names. But the Scripture says to mark those who cause division, not by pointing out false doctrine, but mark those who cause division by false doctrine, and to avoid them, to have nothing to do with them. And of them, Peter says, quote, "Their destruction is not asleep." Justin, by the way, quoted from that last week in his sermon. In other words, when it comes to false teachers, wait. Just wait. Please trust me. I'm not an expert at very many things. I don't have that many skills, and I have little acumen, but I've watched wolves in sheep's clothing a lot. Take my word for it. Their destruction is not asleep. I mean, the Lord reconciles all of his accounts God settles all of his scores. The Lord is not going to ignore false teaching forever, and he's not ignoring it now, really. He's just taking careful notes. God's wrath will not be delayed. It's merely building. His anger is not quenched except by the blood of Christ. It's just filling up the winepress of the fury of his wrath. He will smite his enemies in due time. I've seen it, I've chronicled it, and I've watched it with a careful eye as heretic after heretic comes to disrepute and scorn. God will not be mocked.